Well, welcome. This is Dan Patterson from Questioning Christianity, and we are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And what we're trying to do in this series, in these QC conversations, is really trying to help throw the questions that matter at someone who knows what they are talking about. So if you're brand new to exploring Christianity, if you haven't seen this before, please do follow the link that's coming up now on the screen. The link tree takes you to all of the available podcasts, all of the websites, YouTube and social media. Everything that you might need is just there. But let me give you a hint into what we're going to be doing tonight, because our episode for this QC conversation is all on doubt, skepticism, and deconstruction. And tons of the questions that we have come in through our website, particularly, or over socials, really come from people who are either insiders to Christianity and are asking hard questions of what they believe. They're unsure as to whether or not it stacks up, and whether or not they can keep believing, or whether it is even really good news. And certainly many people from the outside looking in, newcomers or skeptics, who have their hard questions as well in this area of doubt, skepticism, and deconstruction. And so we have a special treat for you for this episode, where we're inviting on someone who is well versed in these kinds of questions, because he has hosted on his very popular podcast, The Unbelievable Show, many of the world's greatest thinkers, skeptics, and believers alike, to actually hash out the kind of questions that we're going to be asking tonight. But I get the great opportunity to reverse the roles, because he's usually the moderator in these conversations, but tonight himself has to face them down and be able to sit in the hot seat. And so it is my privilege to welcome on Justin Brierley. Welcome, mate.
Thank you very much for having me, Dan. It's great to be with you, and and to join the audience who may be watching in Australia and beyond, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Well, for our listeners who don't know you, Justin, you are obviously the host of The Unbelievable Show, which has been going now, about 15, 16 years? Must have a pretty long...
Yeah, it has. Yeah, it's been going remarkably long. I measure it almost as long as the my oldest child. So Noah is 16, nearly turning 17, and he was about a year old when I began the show. So that makes me feel really old in terms of how long it's been going. But it started as a radio show primarily, and then a couple of years in became a podcast. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, we started really taking the YouTube thing seriously as well. So that's how most people know us, is through the podcast, and more recently through the YouTube show as well.
Yeah, and you've sort of expanded into this series called The Big Conversation as well, where you're really taking some of the headline names when it comes to key thought or areas of research, or really the frontiers of human development, to try and hash out from different perspectives some of life's deepest questions. And so fill us in a little bit about that series.
Yeah, The Big Conversation is a series we began in 2018 from Unbelievable. So that was really when we started producing our video discussions, and we were blessed to have right at the beginning, a big name, or someone who would very quickly become a big name, Jordan Peterson, in conversation with atheist psychologist Susan Blackmore. And The Big Conversation is a special series that has been effectively done in partnership with the John Templeton Foundation. And so that's given us the ability to invite some of the biggest names from across the world. So in that first season, we had people like Steven Pinker and Daniel Dennett and Jordan Peterson and many others on the kind of more secular side, if you will. Opposite people like John Lennox, and we've had in the most recent series N.T. Wright, Bishop Robert Barron, and lots of other, interesting thinkers. Rosalind Picard was one of those featured in the most recent series this year.
And I think my mate AI Luke Barnes here, another Aussie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Luke Barnes, debating the fine-tuning of the universe with Sabine Hossenfelder, who's a sort of atheist physicist in Germany, and debating AI as well, as I mentioned, with Rosalind Picard, opposite Nick Bostrom, who's quite a big name in the world of AI and so on. So it's exciting when you get to bring together these really interesting people. Normally the format is, a Christian and a non-Christian opposite each other. Not always, but most frequently. Yeah. And it's yielded, really interesting conversations, but also it's been great to see the way it's helped the show to reach many more people because of the interest that these kinds of shows and names have generated as we've been able to put them out.
Yeah, and a few years ago, you even wrote interesting books. I think it was just after you had the sort of 10-year anniversary of the show, you went on to pen this book, Unbelievable. So same as the podcast, but why after 10 years you're still a Christian, having talked to so many kind of atheists. Fill us in just a little bit about what inspired that book.
Yeah. And like any good self-promoter, I've got a copy right here. It was basically published about 10 years into the show, so it came out in 2017 actually. And yeah, as the title says, the subtitle is "Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian." So around the 10-year mark of the show, I did a kind of Ask Me Anything sort of edition of the show, and a lot of the questions were around the theme of, well, how come after all these years of hearing all these objections from leading atheists and skeptics, why are you still a Christian? And I thought that, yeah, could be a good premise for a book, drawing on the conversations and all the lessons I've learned from hearing both sides of the debates, but kind of then putting my case for faith in the process. And so that's what I aim to do with the book, just to sort of do that kind of mere Christianity. You know, here's where I would start with someone who was asking, why do you actually believe this stuff is true, and how do you respond to some of the common objections to Christian faith? So that's what the book is really. And yeah, it's been exciting to see that being picked up by lots of people all over the world, and it's actually opened up a lot more opportunities for me, not just to host dialogues, but to be kind of making the affirmative case in some cases, you know. So I've been involved in more dialogues where I'm actually involved as one of the participants, or doing talks and that kind of thing.
Yeah, man, I really appreciated the book when I read it. It was a number of years ago, and so it's actually packed up in my library. We're building a house this year, and so I wish I could have it right in front of me. But when I first read it, I just thought this is a really helpful way for people to grapple with kind of the majors of what is the case for Christianity, but not just why would you believe it rationally, but also why might you want to believe it? Why would you care if this is true? And so just really appreciated the way that you sort of framed that. So if anyone's kind of watching and this is the first time you've seen Justin before, I would definitely recommend that you jump over now to whatever podcast app you have and make sure you subscribe to Unbelievable. There's 16-ish years of a back catalogue there that you can go and listen to a show on pretty much any topic or question that you might have. And particularly then to jump over on YouTube and to check out The Big Conversation. A ton of people that I know have been on there. It is a wonderful, wonderful program to really get to a higher level thinking on so many of the big questions of our time. So make sure you don't miss that chance. And I'm sure Justin would love it if you picked up a copy of the book and send him thoughts on how it impacted you as well. But we're going to dive into some of those contents tonight. And Justin, if you could just fill us in maybe a little bit about your own story. So maybe how you became a Christian in the first place, and particularly how you got involved with this sort of radio show where you're bringing on a Christian and a non-Christian to hash out a big question.
Yeah, well, I was raised in a Christian family, and to that extent, you know, that was a gift in a way, that I had that kind of atmosphere around me. Now, just being born in a Christian family obviously doesn't make you a Christian. It's not something that you sort of inherit, you know, like you inherit the family silver or something. But it was certainly gave me the opportunity to begin exploring faith for myself from a young age. I'd say, you know, up to my mid-teens, you know, I just went to church because my parents took me, really. But it was really in my sort of mid to late teens that I started to, I think, take it seriously for myself. And there was particularly a helpful, wise youth pastor who was part of my journey to really owning my faith for myself. So that happened sort of probably when I was about 15, and yeah, I had an experience really, which for me really, I really felt different, that something had happened in my life, that there was this new reality, that I was in a relationship with Jesus Christ, you know, to use the lingo. But so that was the start really of it, and it was very much an experiential, you know, something that had happened to me. It was an internal experience, but something where, you know, I really felt different afterwards. But I think soon, you know, that it wasn't too long before I was off to university, and there inevitably you will meet plenty of skepticism. And although there was a strong, thriving Christian union at Oxford University where I went to, there were also lots of questions that came out, obviously, in those late night, you know, chats that you have with other students and your peers. So I began thinking, I think, through some of the, you know, the objections to Christian faith at that point. And I even went through, you know, pretty significant season of doubt in one particular term, I remember. But it was really through authors like C.S. Lewis and others that I really began to delve into what I would later learn is often called Christian apologetics, and realized that there are, interesting arguments for the truth of Christianity. There's intellectual, philosophical, scientific arguments. There's historical arguments, and that sort of, as I started to read more widely in that area, I decided this might be something I'd like to pursue in the future. Now, I was I was into acting, drama, arts, that kind of thing, and so I sensed that I might end up doing something in journalism, maybe broadcast. Ended up in the end having met my wife, and we got married and went on a gap year. Ended up actually applying for some work experience at Premier Christian Radio in the UK, which is one of the UK's only sort of Christian radio stations. That turned into a job. That turned into sort of becoming a regular presenter on air. And after a few years in starting my own show, Unbelievable, where I went to the CEO of the station and said, look, we're doing a great job at talking to Christians about Christian things, and that's all important. But most Christians in the UK, spend most of their time alongside non-Christian friends and neighbours and family. So what if we brought some non-Christians in, on air, and just had conversations with them, and I could moderate some conversations between Christians and non-Christians. And that was really where Unbelievable was born. It was a simple idea, but it's essentially remained the same for the last 15 plus years that it's been going. And that's been very exciting. And what began just as a radio show broadcasting to a primarily Christian audience in the UK, a couple of years in, we were quite early adopters of the podcast format, and actually we were able to start putting these podcasts out, and suddenly finding a lot of non-Christians also wanting to listen and engage. So we started to pick up this other virtual audience, and really that's where the story's gone from then, that we've had this dual audience of Christians and non-Christians who listen to the show. And as one friend of mine puts it, the show is a sort of demilitarized zone for having hopefully genuine conversations between Christians and non-Christians, and we do a lot of the discussion between Christians of different flavors, different forms of theology that get debated. But at the core of the show, there's always been this desire to host meaningful conversations about the most important questions, and that's really what Unbelievable is.
Yeah, well, I commend you, mate, because I think a lot of the ability to have these conversations without a ton of sparks flying sometimes, but most of the time not, comes down to you just being such a nice guy and moderating those conversations in such a helpful way, just helping people really respond to the substance. So well done in doing all of that for so long. Over the years, you've had some fascinating guests on there. You've already mentioned a ton of them, but some of the Christian heavyweights like John Lennox, who teaches at Oxford, or people like Tim Keller, who's a well-known Christian pastor. You've had a lot of the more secular guys, but agnostic, I guess you might say, the Douglas Murrays and Tom Hollands and Jordan Petersons of the world, right down to, the four horsemen of the new atheist apocalypse, as it was so called maybe a decade or so ago. And so just fascinating conversation. I'm interested to hear from you, which of those would be just some highlights in terms of the conversations that you've hosted. What ones really stood out to you as maybe the most impactful personally?
Yeah, gosh, it's like asking me to choose between my children, isn't it? Which are my favorite. I think that there's been some really interesting ones. I mean, when we get the opportunity to do a live show in front of people, that kind of has quite a different dynamic to just doing something in person. And when you're just two of you in a studio, three of you in a studio, there's sort of a bit of a kind of intimate dynamic, and some things happen there that wouldn't necessarily happen in front of a live audience, where there's a bit more of a kind of potential that people feel they need to kind of put on a show, as it were. So for instance, one of my most memorable episodes in recent years was with Tom Holland, who, for those who aren't familiar with him, he's a historian, popular historian. He wrote a big book a couple of years ago now called Dominion, The Making of the Christian Mind. And it was really about the way that Christianity shaped all of culture, history, human rights, and everything else since its inception. And he himself, has not sort of professed Christianity particularly. He would say he whatever faith he had kind of fizzled out in his teenage years, but he came to realize how completely enculturated he is by Christianity, and he began to get into arguments with atheists and humanists who claimed, no, we don't need Christianity. We would have become these kinds of people believing in human rights and so on without Christianity getting in the way. It's been a blocker, if anything, on our progress. And he very strongly contests that and says, actually, everything you value really is a product of the Christian culture that you've grown up in. And so I had him on. This was my second series of The Big Conversation with A.C. Grayling, who's quite a well-known atheist philosopher. And well, now I don't always, I try to have shows where it's friendly and fruitful in terms of the conversation, but the sparks did fly on that one. It was a really feisty exchange between them, and it's just a fascinating interaction. Two very smart guys, very intellectual, who know their stuff, and just having a really interesting debate on whether Christianity essentially has been good or bad for us in the long run. Whether it was a block on culture and history, which is the claim that A.C. Grayling has made in his books, or whether actually we owe all of that we value about the modern world in the West to Christianity, which is essentially Tom Holland's thesis. So that was a big highlight of the past year, past couple of years. But then that was one done in studio, so it had that kind of dynamic. There was a very memorable one, again, part of that second season of The Big Conversation, where I went to the US did a live show there. This was before lockdown stopped that being able to happen as much. But this was with Dave Rubin, who listeners or viewers may know is fairly well known as a podcast and YouTube host himself, does the Rubin Report, kind of very much sort of on the kind of conservative end, socially and culturally, anti-woke kind of is he's part of that sort of, group, if you like, but has been on an interesting journey, not just politically, but also spiritually, I'd say, in recent years. And so I invited him on to have an on-stage discussion with John Lennox, who's a brilliant, as you said, Christian thinker, Oxford professor, mathematician, scientist. And they just had the most interesting discussion. It was quite unlike almost any other show I'd done, actually, because they just immediately went to this very kind of personable, intimate level where, Dave Rubin was very open in terms of his own spiritual journey. Perhaps, one of the most interesting things he talked about in that, I think really for the first time, was that he, having once considered himself an atheist, and having been very influenced by the horsemen, Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and so on, he said that he's actually decided in the last few years that he isn't an atheist, and he's not quite sure what to call himself, but he, especially under the influence, I think, of people like Jordan Peterson, who's been something of a mentor to him, he just doesn't think that label fits him anymore, and talked very openly about how he's genuinely looking into his own Jewish roots again, and he's even open to the claims of Christianity. And so it was just one of those remarkable sorts of conversations where, in front of about 1,000 people, we just had this amazing dialogue. So yeah, those are a couple. If I had to choose a couple that were especially meaningful.
Yeah, I remember listening to that and just being amazed by how personal it was, and just the warmth of the conversation between John and Dave. It felt like you're around a dinner table or in the pub in the middle of the night, just listening to the two of them chat back and forth, and it just seemed like a unique softness.
Yeah, and a good example of the way two shows can be completely different, because it was obviously the exact opposite almost with the A.C. Grayling and Holland one, where it was a proper old debate. And whereas this one was something completely different, but both coming from the same show. So two examples of the kinds of different conversations that can be had on the show.
And Unbelievable certainly has a number of shows in its back catalogue where there are some sparks that are part of the show, and so if people enjoy that kind of thing, they'll find that in the catalogue as well. But I'm interested as having to moderate these conversations, maybe where sometimes religious or political or big cultural topic conversations can really get derailed, even just at a personal one-on-one level. As a moderator who's had to try and take out the heat and keep in the light, what would be your tips or your hints towards having better God conversations or conversations around these sorts of topics?
I think it's about being open rather than defensive. I think sometimes Christians, especially, can go into discussions and feel like they have to, bat away every single critique or objection, and like have, this rock lid iron cast defense before they can engage in a conversation. But that's not how conversations happen naturally as such, but rather to have a genuine conversation. And that's why, we've called this series the Big Conversation, because I think conversations are important, and it's fine to say sometimes I don't know, or I'll look into that, or give me more time on that one, or whatever. And to that degree, certainly one of the lessons I've learned in all the years of hosting Unbelievable is that confidence isn't about being able to beat someone in an argument. It's about being able to simply hold your beliefs while listening to someone and engaging them helpfully, fruitfully, if they don't share that belief, and not feeling like you're being threatened. And I think fear is actually quite often what drives a lot of people of faith. They either don't engage with people who have objections or are skeptical because they're worried that it's going to shake their faith in some way, or when they do engage, it's done in a kind of knee-jerk, almost I'm offended by you kind of way, because you're questioning my deepest held beliefs and notions, and neither of those ways of engaging is ultimately helpful. What I think Christians need to develop is a kind of an openness to hearing, responding graciously, and not being put on the back foot, but simply saying, okay, I hear what you're saying, and it's a good objection. Here's one way of thinking about it. But engaging it, and frequently that helps to just bring the barriers down, in my experience, because unfortunately I think a lot of people who are not in the church, are not Christians, they've often experienced a kind of bit more of a combative or assertive or too dogmatic form of Christianity, where if you ask questions or raise doubts, or you're branded a heretic, or you're kind of dismissed, or simply argued at, and that ultimately makes people think, well, these people aren't interested actually in having proper conversations or hearing my point of view. So that for me is the essential thing. Confident enough not to win an argument, in a way, is
so
almost
good.
the irony.
Oh, I so appreciate that. And I just think, the way that you absorb some of maybe the criticism or the strength with which someone begins to share their concerns or their objections, and they just realize that I am willing to listen, willing to respond, willing to have a meaningful conversation without having to respond in kind. So super helpful. We had probably the biggest question on this came in from various of our listeners, people that asked on the website or through our social media, that they wanted you to answer, was in having these faith conversations then for so long with skeptics and with Christians, what is the argument that you heard from a Christian or a non-Christian that you felt most impressive?
Oh yeah, again, it's hard to choose, because depending on the person making the objection, they can be very compelling and very hard to answer. The obvious one to probably go for would be the problem of suffering, which is something that Christians down the ages have wrestled with. Though, if I'm honest, it's never been a huge kind of deal breaker in my life. So although I've seen other people who have really struggled with it, for whatever reason, it hasn't been one that's particularly kind of troubled me. I have felt like, no, there are ways to understand it intellectually, and I don't know, maybe it's just my personality. I don't get as troubled as some people do by that particular argument. So if you're talking about just on a personal level, what has been sort of one that's really kind of shaken me up, probably, and I'm going back over 10 years now to when I first had Bart Ehrman on my show. Bart Ehrman is quite well known as a skeptical New Testament scholar. In fact, he has a kind of deconversion story of having been a Christian once and then losing his faith for a variety of reasons. But he's quite critical in some ways of the historicity of the New Testament. He's been in a number of debates on my show over the years with other New Testament scholars like Mike Licona and Gary Habermas and others. But the the first time I had him on, it was to have him in discussion with Peter J. Williams, who's a Bible scholar from Cambridge, and it was to debate Barth's book, at the time best-selling book, his kind of breakthrough best-selling book, which is called Misquoting Jesus, in which he made the case that we can't really trust the manuscript, the sort of the Gospels and the New Testament, because of the way that those manuscripts have been passed down over the many years, and so raised in the course of this book all kinds of questions around the historicity and whether we really know what the original writers said and that kind of thing. So I read this book in advance of the discussion, and yeah, I mean, I had 1 or 2 sleepless nights. I was thinking, wow, I haven't come across some of these arguments. Now, looking back now, I've come across them repeatedly, but at the time, these were relatively new to me, you know, and so yeah, I was wondering, gosh, how's this going to go, you know? Anyway, the show came and Peter J. Williams came on, and I would say it's like that proverb, you know, about when one person presents a case, it seems sure, and then someone else comes and then it looks like the other way. It's always interesting when you hear someone who also knows the Bible scholarship back to front and can just put a completely different perspective on some things, because inevitably, I think, you know, without wanting to, Bart does what he does, but he was presenting a very specific spin, if you like, on the nature of the documents and the transmission history and everything else, which once you get someone else who knows the stuff as well, you quickly see actually there's always 2 ways of understanding something. It's, you know, it's either glass half full or glass half empty kind of thing. And what I learned in the process of just hosting that discussion was that actually there is actually a remarkably good history of textual transmission of the scriptures, and that a lot of the problems that Barth was putting a lot of weight on are actually ones that are not as problematic as he made out in the book. And in the end, it really came down to only, you know, a handful of specific places across the whole of the New Testament where he said that maybe there was a different reading than what is actually in our Bible is what should be there. But even in those cases, he had an opinion on what the actual original reading should be. So in the end, I kind of and none of it affected any aspect of doctrine or belief in a sense either. So in the end, it was one of those shows where, having gone, I went from feeling like, whoa, this is a huge sort of, you know, ground shaking potential objection to Christian faith, to having gone through, done some research, hosted the show, realizing actually, no, I actually feel more confident coming out of this. Now, it's not to say my perspective on scripture won't have been changed at some level by the conversation and by reading. Maybe some of my preconceptions about the way scripture comes together, or, you know, and that kind of thing might have to alter in the process. But in the end, I ultimately came out of it with a profound sort of admiration, really, for this, what we call textual criticism, the scientific, if you like, way in which scholars put together the original manuscripts by comparing and contrasting all the many thousands of copies that there are. And it is remarkable that, you know, of all ancient texts, we have an incredibly strong textual sort of history for the Bible when you actually put it in comparison with others. So that was just one example, and I'm sorry to have gone on so long about it, but that,
no,
that
I think
was
it's
one. Yeah.
I think it's so helpful for people to realize that many of the questions that might initially come up, they can feel huge and maybe even insurmountable, but you can then dig into these doubts, and you've got that invitation to as part of the Christian story. And it kind of leads into the title of your book. I really appreciate both the podcast and your book being called Unbelievable, because that taps into what many people in our culture feel when it comes to the God question, that given the scientific kind of vision of the world, or given the modern objections that come up culturally speaking and morally speaking, it just doesn't really hold up. It doesn't stand up under scrutiny. At least there's this strong kind of perception that's there. And even in the last number of years, at least 6 or 7, there's been a large cultural phenomenon of the decline of cultural Christianity, of people in Western countries no longer just identifying as Christian on censuses because they don't see themselves as Christian like their parents or their grandparents, or of famous high-profile Christian celebrities or pastors either going through a period of what might be called deconstruction, of rethinking a lot of what they had been told to believe, or even wandering right out of the faith as a whole and making these big public deconversion stories. And so this question of, is Christianity really believable, and what do we do with those doubts or those hard barriers that seem to come up at different points? So if we could dig down into that kind of concept for a second. On this theme of unbelievable, why do you think belief in God is so hard?
Yeah, I think there's a multiplicity of factors, obviously. I think inevitably there has been the rise of a kind of really almost dogmatic strain of skepticism in the new atheism, which was also reacting against, I think, certain dogmatic fundamentalist forms of Christianity. And so that was sort of, in a way, a response to something that probably needed some correction in the Christian church. I think, I will meet people who have never been Christians, who are, believe they never will be a Christian because they think it's all fairy tales and nonsense, or, just a power play by church organizations, institutional, religion and so on. And I think a lot of where those people are coming from is often essentially they've read a particular narrative, or they've kind of seen a particular way in which they think the church is, from media, whatever. Now there may be some truth to that. There are lots of ways in which the church is very imperfect and has done damage, but I don't tend to find those people actually are that familiar with actually normal, regular churches on the ground. And if they did meet normal, everyday Christians, they'd find that they weren't these sort of power hungry, culture warriors or whatever that they fear. They're actually pretty normal, often very nice people, actually. And that local churches are often doing a great job making a difference where they are. And once people do encounter that, I think that sometimes is the first step to just sort of changing their perspective on the whole idea of Christianity and God and church and that kind of thing. Yeah. I also meet, and quite often have them on the show, people who are ex-Christians, people who are former Christians, people who have maybe gone on some kind of deconstruction journey, like you mentioned. And obviously that's a bit different, because they maybe have been part of a Christian church and community. And sometimes they will still acknowledge the value of that and how much it meant to them. But at the same time, they will have perhaps frequently, what I find is their personal journey kind of didn't match, if you like, the way their intellectual journey went or their cultural journey went, just started to be really out of step with what they were being told was the quote unquote truth in their church. And sometimes in specific cases, that's because, as I say, there's been a very sort of dogmatic, sort of fundamentalist approach to certain aspects of Christianity. And so let's take, for instance, how do you interpret, the early chapters of Genesis? And for Christians who were told there's only one way of understanding that, and that's a literal 6-day creation, then they go to college or, just sort of, read more widely, and they quickly find that there's this contradiction there. And that often, things like that can be the thing that causes someone to ultimately question and leave their faith. But then I also find people who haven't deconstructed have reconstructed, if you like. So it's not only that one thing happens. Very often I find people who've kind of had to go through that sort of renegotiating maybe what they were taught, but not feeling like they have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and actually coming to a fresh new understanding of how to understand Christian faith, the Bible, maybe. And frequently that's simply about getting out of these particular cultural version of Christianity that basically was presented to you as the only valid version, and seeing that there's a wide history of Christian churches and expressions of Christianity down the ages, and that the kinds of questions that we often get in a muddle over today have been addressed many times, through history by theologians and church fathers and everything else. And often it's just putting people in touch with historic Orthodox Christianity, where there is actually, which isn't so sort of invested in very specifically 21st century controversies, around biblical inerrancy or whatever, helps people to realize actually, this isn't what I was presented, may not have been the full picture, if you like.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think that's an important part of the journey for a lot of people, is to kind of, often in the deconstruction stories, I find what people are reacting to or rejecting isn't necessarily Christianity per se. It's the particular cultural version of Christianity that they've been exposed to or brought up in. And I can understand that. And, but that doesn't mean that Christianity is false necessarily. It just means that you maybe have been exposed to a limited or, a faulty version of it. And that sadly does happen, in the world we live in.
Yeah. And for people, maybe one of the common features I notice within these deconversion stories, or even just people that are deconstructing, sort of taking down the edifice of what they'd been passed on from their particular church culture, and then just looking and saying, man, is there anything worth believing in here? A common thread is this, I guess, question as to, are doubts really something that I'm allowed to have as a Christian, or does the church take my doubts seriously? Are they actually offering any meaningful answers to these questions? And for newcomers, there's this idea of, what am I allowed to question? Am I really allowed to dig into and to scrutinize Christianity, or do I just have to swallow what I'm told, hook, line, and sinker, and check my brain at the door? What space would you say there is for doubt as a Christian, and asking questions as a newcomer, sort of investigating whether it's true? Is the Christian faith and story open to that, or would you say it's more anti-intellectual?
Well, you may not be surprised to know that I think it is open to doubt and to questions. And, you read that right on the pages of the gospel, people who doubted all the time. Now, their doubts were often addressed, but they weren't told, you just have to believe because I've told you to. It was because they will see some kind of evidence. They will be presented with something that makes sense of their doubts. And, so whether it's the man who comes to Jesus, whose child is sick, and he says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. We're all a mixture, aren't we, of both, yes, at certain points being convinced, maybe we do believe, and at certain points not being convinced. We are doubtful. Even in the sort of resurrection and ascension accounts, there's sort of this extraordinary line about, but some who were there doubted, and it's like, these were people who were right there, according to the author, and yet they had doubts. And so, it's been said many times before, but doubt is just part of, in my view, the Christian journey. Faith very rarely exists in the absence of doubt. In some ways, if there was no doubt, there's almost a level at which it wouldn't be faith, in as much as faith and certainty aren't the same thing, in the sense, belief in God, trusting in God, perhaps is a better way of putting it, is not the same thing as, believing in a mathematical proof. It's something in which we have to invest ourselves. We have to sort of say, okay, I may never have some sort of absolute proof of this thing, but I've been given enough that this makes sense of me and the world around me, that it's a compelling explanation. And but the only way I can test it is actually by stepping into it. And that's what faith is. It's actually leaning into something that you've come to believe may be true and testing it. And for me, that's very different to sort of just mentally assenting to, yes, a divine being exists, sort of thing. Well,
Yeah.
anyone could believe that. It may not make any difference. But faith is something more than that. It's actually sort of putting that to the test in a way.
Yeah. And I mean, you commented before about the Bart Ehrman experience of, you've all of a sudden read his book, Misquoting Jesus, and it brings up these questions that you didn't have answers to about the reliability of the New Testament. And your response was not just to sit in that doubt and not do anything with it, but actually to maybe ask questions, to look at other sources, to see, hey, Peter, what do you say in response to this? As another sort of New Testament or textual scholar, how do I respond to these sorts of questions? And you investigate to see whether or not there are meaningful answers to some of these questions, at least enough answers for you to have, like you said, enough confidence or trust that you really can lean in. And
exactly. And I think the thing is that if you believe that being able to commit yourself to Christianity involves basically being certain on everything, then no, you'll never get there, because there are any innumerable number of questions you haven't even thought of yet that might kind of, throw you off in that way. And likewise, I think there's always going to be areas where we don't know things, where it is a bit of a mystery, where we're not sure we have all the answers. I suppose the question for me is there enough because I tend to look at the whole picture holistically. I don't just say, if there's an issue with some view of scripture, is that a game changer? Is that going to sort of, if I've got a question or a doubt in this area, does it mean does it throw the whole thing out? And no, it doesn't for me, because one of the things I kind of major on a lot in the book I wrote is that everyone comes to reality with a worldview, and all of those worldviews have holes. They all have questions that arise in them. It's not as though, well, if I just got rid of Christianity, then my world, it'd be fine. My worldview would match reality. Well, no, it wouldn't actually. There's all kinds of things about the way life is, the way the universe is, the way I experience reality, that don't make much sense on a kind of atheist naturalist worldview either. And so in a sense, it's not as though one particular worldview, Christianity or atheism or Islam or whatever, sort of has to give you every single answer for it to be valid. It's that actually you're kind of a lot of the time simply saying, okay, what makes best sense? What makes best sense? I may not know, it may not give me 100%, clarity on everything, but which of these worldviews, atheism, Christianity, something else, makes best sense of the available data? And what I've found is that Christianity makes best sense of the most amount of data, if you like, not just scriptural historical data, but sort of scientific data, actually. The sense I have that there really is purpose and meaning and value in life, those kinds of issues, all of those have to factor into the question of, do I believe this is true? It's not going to all hang on one book that Bart Ehrman wrote, if you know what I mean. So for me, that's been quite an important part of the journey, learning to see things in the whole, rather than sort of majoring on one particular thing and thinking that the whole of my faith somehow depends on, getting that one thing right or answered.
And that's really helpful, I guess, in terms of coming up with what's that base foundation that you say, this is stable, this is the thing that I think makes the most sense. And then constructing the kind of more specific beliefs that you have, actually being willing to swap bits out. Say, actually, I think that's wrong in a better review of the evidence, or this way that I frame the hypothesis actually isn't the best way to do that, and I can change it. And one of the other questions that we had come in a lot from listeners really had to do with what's something in the process of hosting Unbelievable or having so many faith conversations with Christians and different theologians and thinkers, as well as from people outside of the Christian story. What's one thing that you might have been persuaded to change?
So in terms of a personal sort of belief, probably. I mean, as I say, my perspective on the scripture has changed in a way. Not that I guess I just know more now than I did about the way in which the Bible came together and the way to understand different genres of scripture and that kind of thing. So I think so many of the confusions that come for people when it comes to understanding the Bible is that they don't necessarily read it as a library of books, and in any library you will have different genres. Some bits are scientific, some bits are historical, some bits are fictional, some bits are reference, whatever, and likewise in the Bible there's this range of different genres of scripture, and kind of just coming to the realization that the Bible didn't sort of fall out of the sky, sort of leather bound with the red bits sort of highlighted. It was a product of thousands of years of humans, and it reflects that thousands of years journey in terms of the what's in there and the different cultures and ways in which people thought and wrote and everything. And yet despite all that, it's got this extraordinary harmony and unity that for me is almost a mark of its authenticity, because it's almost miraculous, I think, the way in which it does, even having been written in all these times, places and cultures, have this remarkable sense of unity. But that comes, recognizing that comes through actually getting to know it and really going on a journey of coming to appreciate what it actually is, rather than just a sort of, the Bible says it, that settles it, I believe it kind of, approach, where it's a very unthinking kind of wooden sort of approach to scripture.
Yeah.
So that's one example of where
I always say
it's just developed a lot.
Yeah, I always say it's way more complex than you think, and way more rich and good than you think in that respect. So I very much echo that experience. Well, let's switch a little bit then to the second, I guess, the subtitle of your book, because it's why, after 10 years of talking with atheists, I'm still a Christian. I'm fascinated to dig down into, without stealing all the thunder from your book, so people can still pick it up and read it. What would you sketch out are your reasons for still believing, even given the skepticism of our era?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think whenever you're approaching this question, I think it's helpful to say we all approach things from a particular worldview, and in a way, it was probably, at some point early on that the penny dropped, that actually whenever I'm inviting an atheist skeptic on, they invariably actually do have a set of beliefs about the way the world is. It's not that they're just a sort of neutral bystander waiting for me to give them all the evidence for my strange set of supernatural beliefs. It's actually that they hold to a particular worldview, which frequently is something like materialism or naturalism, the view that all that ultimately exists is the natural forces of the universe, natural laws, matter, energy, and that everything, all of our human experience, and everything we believe about life can essentially be boiled down to matter, emotion, really, and coming to realize that actually leaves a lot of question marks about then, well, why do we have this belief in the idea of, for instance, human dignity and value? Is that just a kind of byproduct of a sort of random evolution in a way, or could it be that actually that very deep sense we have that there really is a way to live, a way to be human, that goes beyond just sort of the happenstance of what we happen to get dealt with, that actually that suggests there is something beyond the material world. Actually, there is a way in which we're supposed to live and act and be. So that's one example. Another example is the fact that we're here. Human existence itself, I think, is a pretty remarkable thing. And when you actually look at what it took to get humans here, it doesn't make as much sense in the kind of, no, it really is just a cosmic accident kind of view, which I think is ultimately what an atheist materialist is committed to. That doesn't make as much sense to me as the Christian view that there was an intelligent mind behind the universe that purposed us. Because when I look at, on the scientific front, things like Big Bang cosmology, the fine tuning of the universe, those kinds of things, they seem to fit better with a theistic, a Christian view of things than a atheist one. And then when I add in certain philosophical arguments, like the fact that, well, why is there something rather than nothing? This goes back to Aquinas and others, Leibniz and others, and those aren't just academic questions for ivory towers. Actually, when you think about it, it's really it's the most obvious question, but the one we never ask, because we just take existence for granted. But why is there physical reality? Why? There's nothing about it that says it has to be this way, that there had to be a universe, there had to be you and me in it. And again, when you dig into that, I find the Christian answer, God as a sort of necessary first thing, there has to be a necessary ground to reality, something that isn't just contingent like physical stuff is. That seems to make sense to me. So I sort of so I find that there's sort of various aspects of our experience of existence that seem to suggest that the Christian story kind of makes sense of this data, if you like, and I've struggled to see the atheist story making sense of it. And likewise, you could go on and talk about purpose and meaning and which account of reality better explains our sense of purpose and meaning. Again, I find Christianity tells a better story, a more compelling story. about that. Now, that's not to say there aren't questions, there aren't mysteries. Absolutely there are. It's not that it gives you every answer to every question, but it gives me a more coherent, complete sense of who I am and the world I've been placed in than the naturalist atheist account does. So that is where I tend to start, and that's where I do in the book with my kind of case for Christianity, and then move on to sort of the historical and biblical aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot of that maybe in the way I answer questions from students whenever I'm doing talks in that environment. And maybe the most popular follow-up question is, but doesn't so much of what you just said, wouldn't that fit any other religious story, whether it was to be Islam or Judaism as other monotheistic versions, or even other theistic pictures where there might be some supernatural forces involved or a mind behind it all? So what for you would be the most persuasive thing why you've taken that next step to say yes to Jesus?
Yeah, and I agree. And I got into TikTok at the beginning of this year and just started doing some sort of 60-second sort of, very brief thoughts.
You're a brave man.
Apologetic arguments. Yeah. Well, it's been interesting. I've really been following in the footsteps of my son, my oldest son, Noah, who is like Mr. TikTok superstar. He doesn't particularly do Christian stuff, but he taught me the ropes of how to start putting some of my thoughts and content into that format. But and having done a few sort of these, TikToks arguing for, God as a first cause or the fine tuning of the universe and that kind of thing, the most frequent question was, okay, maybe, but then which God? Why your God? Well, out of all the hundreds of gods that exist, and it's an absolutely valid question. And one of the ways in which I've responded to this is, sometimes people would say, wouldn't you have to investigate every single religion out there to know that yours is the right one? And I've likened it to the fact that I have a big bunch of keys that are for the church where my wife is the minister, and every so often I go down there and need to open up the front door of the church, but all the keys look pretty similar, and sometimes I try a few in the lock until I find the right one. Okay, and open the door and go in. Now, having found the right one, I then don't check every other key as well, just to see if that also might open them. I know there's only one key that's going to do the job. And it's a bit like that for me with Christianity. You might spend some time trying to work it out, but is there a key? Is there a key that suddenly opens the lock and makes sense of enough things that actually you think, no, I don't need to endlessly research every other religion. I know that there's something about this that means that it must be true, even if, I was asked to go and look at lots of other cases for God and religion. And for me, in the Christian story, that is the person of Jesus Christ and the claim that he lived, died, and came back to life. Because if that's true, if you could be, pretty certain of that, if that makes sense, then I think you've got the key that opens the lock. You don't have to endlessly search the claims of every other religion out there. And it's not that there's no value in all of those other religions. There may well be things that ethical views, whatever, certain doctrines that kind of, that there's some harmony between Christianity and but if you like, what tends to be the defining feature between Christianity and any other religion, be it Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, or whatever, is the person of Jesus Christ and the claims he made about himself. And that is, if you like, for me, the way in which we go to that next stage and say, okay, maybe I believe there's a God behind it all. Has that God been revealed in any specific way? And I'd say, yes, there's good evidence that God did come in the person of Jesus Christ and vindicated his claims to be God by dying and rising again. And once you look into the case for that, a lot of people have been surprised at just how historically cogent and compelling the case is for the idea that this whole Christian movement really did start because what they said happened actually happened. So that's where I would go.
For someone, I really appreciate the key analogy. I think it's brilliant. I saw the TikTok this morning, actually, as it came up in my feed. But for those people who feel like they've tried that key, they've grown up in the church, they feel like they actually had this relationship with Jesus, deconversion stories or the deconstructions, people that just feel like their belief system's kind of crumbling around them and they don't know what they can hold on to. Like, think of many of the guests you might have had on your show over the years, and this is sort of just maybe a parting question for you. If you were to be able to turn off the mics and head down to the local watering hole and just spend some time chatting about real deep things, what would you want to say about Jesus to someone who's been there, feels like they've tried it, and that key didn't unlock that door?
Yeah. Firstly, I'd want to hear their story, because everyone's story is different and there's going to have been different things. And I'm not going to go in there claiming, look, you've just got this wrong and I need to set you straight, because I don't know that person's story and what they've been told or the experiences they've been through. So I just want to sit and listen and just hear what they have to say. And then I suppose I would say, maybe to extend the analogy, the lock that once seemed to fit seems to have, suddenly either the door's changed or something's gone wrong in the manufacturing. Something's just not fitting anymore, right? Maybe that's because you've changed. Maybe the institution that you're a part of has changed. Maybe you've moved in different directions. That doesn't necessarily stop the story itself being true. It's either true or false that Jesus rose from the dead. That either means, that either makes all the difference in the world or it doesn't in the end. And for me, I'd say that there is this historical bedrock to Christianity, and that's kind of a good starting point. But the way that then gets expressed in different church institutions and in different experiences is very varied, and sadly can often lead to disappointment, frustration, and people just wanting to pack it all in. And I'm very sympathetic to that. I can see why many people would want to do that. I suppose I just want to say I don't think the fact that it doesn't make sense at this point doesn't mean don't throw in the towel. There are many people who have gone through this experience and have come out the other side, and it has developed and flourished into something much more meaningful and deeper and richer ultimately. And sometimes, you do need a break. You do need to sort of say, actually, this isn't feeding me, this is toxic, or whatever. I can't be part of this right now. That's fine. But I do believe God's still there. God's still waiting for us. Maybe not the God that you were told about or grew up with, or the picture of God maybe that came to be the one that you associated with God. But I do believe God's still there, and God is waiting for us, and is always patient, and will, whatever we go through, whether we feel close, far, that God is non-existent. I believe actually that as the Bible says, God works all things for the good of those who love him. And ultimately, I'm happy to kind of leave it in God's hands and just ask people to remain open in that way.
Yeah. Well, Justin, I really appreciate your responses, to be willing to change the other side of the microphone and I guess actually have to face down many of the questions that we've had sent into us. Just really appreciate the tone as well as kind of what you're able to bring to the table. If people wanted to connect with some of those things we talked about before with your podcast or with the big conversation shows, where might you send them? Is there anywhere that would be good for them to connect with your work?
Yeah, so Unbelievable, you can find us on podcast, wherever you get your podcast from. Just search Unbelievable, Justin Brierley. And the big conversation, those all appear on the Unbelievable podcast, but you could check out our YouTube channel as well. So if you look for Unbelievable on YouTube, or thebigconversation.show is the specific website where we host those particular conversations as well, and some of the resources from it. So those are good places to go. And for the book, it's called Unbelievable: Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. So you can find that on Amazon. You can get signed copies and a free Audible trial for the audiobook and that kind of thing via my own website as well, justinbrierley.com, if you want to check that one out too.
Sounds great. Well, mate, really appreciate you giving us some time all the way over from the UK to here. Thankful that the technology kind of holds up, and great to digitally meet you, and thankful for all you had to contribute to this big conversation here on QC Conversation. So until next time, thanks so much, mate.
Thanks, Dan.
No worries. And to all of our regular listeners who are always part of these conversations, we thank you for watching. Would really love any more feedback, particularly on today's episode or future episodes that you'd love to see take place. So please do get in contact at info@questioningchristianity.com if you'd like to see anyone particularly or have any questions yourself you would like to see fielded. For those of you who aren't subscribers, we'd love to be able to hit subscribe and the bell on YouTube, and certainly go and follow us over at socials at QC Socials to see all the various posts. If you're unfamiliar with our channel, not only do we do these bigger conversations where we throw hard questions at someone who knows what they're talking about, but we also have a bunch of short videos of 4 to 5 to 7 minutes where we try and tackle all of these hard questions on judgment, on suffering, on sexuality, on anything that you might have, to really try and feed them through the lens of the Christian story and see whether or not Christianity does stand up and whether it has something meaningful to say. So I'd love you to jump on and join this conversation. Until next time, thanks so much. Bye.